Well, I'd like to welcome to the set Mike Lee, a representative Republican candidate for Senate in the upcoming caucus system here that we have in the state of Utah. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
A major issue that's kind of been percolating throughout this whole campaign is this idea of earmarks and the way in which politicians use earmarks, specifically senators and representatives, to get specific spending to particular programs. What's your stance on the use of earmarks by members of Congress?
Certainly Congress has the power and indeed the duty, the obligation to decide how the money is going to be spent. So it's entirely appropriate for Congress to say we're going to appropriate $10 billion to fund the construction of a new battleship or something like that. The part about earmarks that troubles me, and what I refer to when I refer to an earmark, is an appropriation that's directed at a specific state, a specific municipality or community, or a specific corporation, business. I find those troubling because I think they foster at least the appearance of corruption. And I don't think Congress needs to spend money that way, or ought to. In any event, I think that all such funding requests need to be subject to open airing and full debate before they're acted upon.
So what's your thinking then about how you get funding to these different entities, these businesses in your state, these municipalities in your state? If it's not done through the earmark process, what process do you replace it with to make sure that Utah doesn't get edged out in what I suspect is a highly competitive environment for the appropriation of funds?
Yeah. Well, I think competitive bid processes administered by federal agencies that sponsor these programs can go a long way. And I think when funding is necessary for things like interstate highway funds, you can have formulas that determine how the funds will be allocated to make sure that each state is treated fairly. Based on each state's population, based on each state's need, whatever the program is, you can come up with a formula that will make sure that no state is left out.
So you don't think that this puts Utah at any sort of competitive disadvantage with regard to the spending of these kinds of funds? Because some of those grants, some of those earmarks, I guess they're not grants, but some of those specific directives for how to spend money really do aid a specific entity within the state or the district.
Yeah, that's right, and that's why they're so alluring, that's why they're so appealing, and that's why Congress keeps returning to them over and over and over again. That's exactly why I support a one-year moratorium, a one-year complete ban would go off the bottle completely off of all earmark spending of this sort. And over the long haul, you replace it with a system in which each and every earmark request has to be aired a full 7 days in advance of the vote on the passage of the bill. And during that time period, if any one senator raises an objection to that earmark request, then that earmark dies unless it can garner a full 60-vote supermajority within the Senate, just like any other substantive piece of legislation. If you did that, we could make sure that these things got the airing that they needed. And we could make sure that we didn't get any more bridges to nowhere.
So it's the transparency issue that worries you the most about the practice of using earmarks?
Precisely.
Okay, let's turn to another program that has received quite a bit of coverage in the news lately, certainly over the last year given the economic downturn, and this is the Troubled Asset Relief Program, what's commonly known as TARP. Would you have voted for TARP had you been a senator at the time? Senator Bennett was quite active in promoting that, and how about you? Where would you have come down on that issue?
I would have voted no.
So with regard to this Troubled Asset Relief Program, why would you have voted no?
We've got to move away from the mindset that says that every time something bad happens, the federal government has to step in and fix the problem. We have to get away from the mindset that the federal government is the rich uncle, the lender of last resort, the healthcare provider of last resort, that it's all things to all people. We don't have the money to be doing this in the first place. We didn't have the money at the time that we spent it. And now we're 13, soon to be $14 trillion in debt. And this is why. Because when problems arise, we say, let's throw money at it. So but that's money that we haven't spent.
Yeah, but what about this money that's now coming back to the federal government, that some of these banks are able to pay back, some of these investment firms able to pay back to the government that they originally took, but now, once again, on a more solid financial footing, getting some returns on their investments, paying off the governments? So it really doesn't cost the federal government all that much, but stabilize them at a point where they needed that.
I have yet to be convinced that it doesn't cost the federal government all that much. The fact that some of the banks have repaid some of the money doesn't mean that all of the banks have repaid all of the money. It doesn't mean that we ever had any assurance that that would ever be the case. It doesn't mean that we ever had any assurance that these funds would actually be used to purchase the troubled assets that caused this catastrophe in the first place. The fact is that this was a large-scale appropriation, the likes of which up until that point had been completely without precedent. And I think we acted way too quickly and way too precipitously in just throwing $1 trillion at a problem without putting any adequate constraints in place, without figuring out where we were going to get the money, without figuring out where the constitutional authority comes from to begin with.
Okay. Another major issue that's been in the public eye for several months now, if not over a year, is health care reform. And Senator Bennett was front and center in that debate initially because of his co-sponsorship of a bill with Senator Wyden from Oregon. What specifically about that health care reform bill that Senator Bennett proposed was particularly good or maybe particularly bad?
There are two things about that bill that I particularly dislike. There are other things, and we probably don't have time to go into all of the issues I have with it. You're referring to the Healthy Americans Act,
yes,
which Senator Bennett is co-sponsoring with Senator Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon. Has two elements to it that I find very troubling. First, it essentially declares health care to be a right protected by the federal government. Now, what's a right? Well, a right is something that the government can't do to you. The Bill of Rights tells us the government can't tell me where to go to church or whether to go to church at all. It can't subject me to an unreasonable search or seizure. It can't take away my property without just compensation. So when we call health care a right protected by the federal government, we're saying the federal government can't not provide you health insurance. I don't like that. I find that troubling. I don't find the power to do that in the Constitution. The second thing I find about that that's very troubling is that, like the President's health care proposal, it contains an individual insurance coverage mandate, telling every American, every man, woman, and child, that they have to go out and they have to get health insurance. Not just any health insurance, but the kind of health insurance that Congress, in its infinite wisdom, deems acceptable for the American people. This is taking a very personal, very private, very local decision and putting it in the hands of people in Washington, D.C. To do something like that requires a grant of authority by the Constitution. I don't find that authority in my copy of the Constitution.
So in other words, one of your major concerns about health care reform is that it's using a constitutional authority that you don't find in the Constitution.
Correct.
Let's go then to this idea of constitutional principles. That's a major issue in the campaign. A lot of the candidates talk about constitutional principles, returning government to constitutional principles. What specifically do you mean by returning the government constitutional principles? Or maybe a better way to ask the question is, what constitutional principles are somehow in danger of being undermined if the government proceeds kind of on its current course?
Professor, if there's one thing that the founding generation agreed upon, and they didn't agree on everything, but if there's one thing that they all agreed upon, it was the idea that they were not creating a federal government with general police powers, with unlimited power. Based in large part on their experience with Great Britain, they knew what can happen when you have a national government that has power with no limits. It inevitably results in tyranny. Whether you have a king or a president, it results in tyranny. So if there's one thing they all agreed on, and if there's one thing that they made darn sure that they put into the Constitution, it was that they were creating a national government that didn't have unlimited power. It had limited power.
So it's this idea of limited government that you think is the issue that's most at stake.
That's right. If you can't find a grant of authority in Article 1, Section 8, chances are pretty good Congress can't do it. There are a few other powers granted by the Constitution to Congress elsewhere, outside of Article 1, Section 8, but they're few and far between. Almost every power that Congress has to be traced to Article 1, Section 8.
And how do you turn back a couple of hundred years of constitutional interpretation where Congress has been granted expansive responsibilities, expansive powers to pursue such things as interstate commerce and the like?
First of all, it's not really a couple hundred years.
Okay, 100 years?
I would say 72 years.
72 years.
It started with NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company, with the Commerce Clause at least, where Congress started moving in this direction of where we are now, which is the Supreme Court has said that Congress may act according to the Commerce Clause in any area in which the regulated activity in the aggregate has a substantial effect on interstate commerce. Now, you and I both know that there is virtually no aspect of human existence that cannot be regulated under that standard. And if the Founding Fathers understood, any one of them had understood, that the Commerce Clause would have given Congress plenary authority to regulate anything that they wanted, essentially putting them on the same par with the states, in fact, in a position superior to the states, they would have voted against it.
Okay.
And even if they would have still signed the document, I can guarantee you that the document wouldn't have been ratified, especially in states like Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, where the ratification debates were tight and the vote was close.
Okay, let's turn to one final question, one final issue that, once again, I think is really out in the news, and this is the issue of getting something done in Washington, D.C. There seems to be a great deal of gridlock. Bipartisanship seems to have gone out the window. What kind of reassurance could you provide that you might work or would work with senators from the other side of the aisle to make something happen? Or is it impossible to work with senators from the other side of the aisle simply because they come from different sets of principles?
No, I certainly would never say it's impossible to work with people on the other side of the aisle, but I have a couple responses to that question. First, as I heard Senator Bennett point out in a speech just 2 or 3 weeks ago, while Republicans are in the minority, arguably the only real power Republican senators have while they're in the minority is to vote no. I can vote no just as well as someone who's been there for 3 terms, and I can do it a lot more often. So that's my first response to that. My second response to that is, to the extent there is a suggestion out there that says, look, you can vote for whomever you want, because this is, after all, a republic, and as citizens in a republic, you have the right to elect someone of your choice. But if you elect someone other than the incumbent, you will lose power. You will pay for exercising that right. I find that offensive, and I find that anathema to the very idea of Republican democracy.